September 12, 1944. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty road leading to Camp Hearn, a prisoner of war facility carved out of ranch land 60 miles northwest of Houston. Inside a military transport truck, 32 German women sat in tense silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms stained with weeks of travel across the Atlantic and then by rail through the American South. They had been captured during the Allied advance through France, serving in various support roles for the Wehrmacht. Now they were entering enemy territory, uncertain of what awaited them behind the barbed wire fences they could see approaching in the distance. Greta Schumann pressed her face against the small window, watching the endless expanse of prairie grass roll past. At 24 years old, she had served as a communications specialist in Normandy, believing she was protecting her homeland from invasion. The daughter of a Munich shopkeeper, she had volunteered in 1942 with patriotic enthusiasm. Now, as a prisoner in a foreign land, that enthusiasm had long since faded into exhaustion and fear. She clutched a small photograph of her family, taken before the war when such things as film and leisure time still existed in abundance. The truck slowed as it approached the camp gates. Unlike the grim military installations the women had imagined, this facility looked more like a working cattle ranch with guard towers. Wooden barracks stretched across cleared land, but beyond them, Greta could see actual livestock grazing in pastures. American guards in uniform stood alongside men in civilian clothes, wearing wide-brimmed cowboy hats that seemed absurdly theatrical. The truck came to a stop. The rear canvas flap opened, revealing the face of a tall man in his 40s with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes beneath a Stetson hat. Lieutenant Frank McAllister, though the women didn't know his name yet, extended his hand to help them down from the truck bed. This simple gesture of courtesy caught them off guard. Several women hesitated, unsure if this was some kind of trap or test. Greta was among the first to accept his hand, stepping down onto Texas soil with trembling legs after days of confinement. She noticed immediately that the American soldiers weren't pointing rifles at them or shouting orders. Instead, they stood at a respectful distance, waiting patiently as the women assembled in an uncertain group. What happened next would become the defining moment that none of these women would ever forget. Lieutenant McAllister spoke in slow, clear English, which a translator relayed in German. "Welcome to Camp Hearn. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention with dignity and respect. Tonight, you will have your first proper meal in American custody. We're going to serve you dinner the Texas way." The women exchanged confused glances, unsure what Texas way meant, but grateful at least that they weren't being immediately thrown into cells or subjected to interrogation. The 32 women who stepped off that transport truck represented a cross-section of young German womanhood caught in the machinery of total war. They ranged in age from 19 to 35, hailing from cities and towns across the Reich. Most had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps, believing they were serving in defensive, supportive roles that would keep them far from combat. The reality of modern warfare had proven otherwise. Greta Schumann had been the eldest daughter in a family of 4 children. Her father owned a small bookshop in Munich's University District, a place where ideas and literature had once flourished before the regime began determining which books could be sold. She had studied languages at university for 2 years before the war interrupted her education. When recruitment officers came seeking educated young women for communications work, her parents had been proud. It seemed a patriotic duty, a way to serve, without carrying a weapon. She had been trained in radio operations and cryptography, skills that made her valuable to military intelligence units. Beside her stood Elsa Hoffman, a 21-year-old nurse from Hamburg who had tended wounded soldiers in field hospitals across occupied France. Her hands, small and precise, had saved countless lives through her medical training. She carried guilt not for the healing she had done, but for the uniform she had worn while doing it. Her blue eyes, once bright with youthful optimism, now reflected the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much suffering too young. Anna Weber, at 33, was the oldest among them. She had worked as an administrative clerk, managing supplies and logistics for Wehrmacht units. A widow whose husband had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1942, she had thrown herself into her work as a way to avoid grief. She stood with the rigid posture of someone who maintained dignity through discipline, her dark hair pulled back severely from a face that rarely smiled anymore. The youngest was Liesl Fischer, barely 19, who had served as a telephone operator. She came from a small farming village in Bavaria where everyone knew everyone else, where the war had seemed distant until recruitment notices arrived. She had joined because 3 of her brothers were already fighting, and she wanted to feel part of something larger than herself. Now she stood shivering despite the Texas heat, looking far younger than her years, her blonde braids making her appear almost childlike. These women and their companions had one thing in common beyond their capture. They had believed in something that was now crumbling. News of German defeats had filtered through even before their capture. They had seen the tide turning, watched as retreat became the only option, but they had clung to the idea that they were on the right side, that their cause was just, that their leaders spoke truth. That faith was about to be tested in ways none of them could have imagined, starting with a simple meal that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemies. Lieutenant Frank McAllister had grown up on a cattle ranch 30 miles from where Camp Hearn now stood. At 46 years old, he was too old for frontline combat, but his organizational skills and his deep understanding of managing people and resources had made him valuable to the Army. When orders came to establish a prisoner of war facility in his home territory, he had been the natural choice to command it. But Frank ran his camp differently than most military installations. He believed that men, and now women, worked better when treated with dignity than when ruled by fear. His second in command was Sergeant Robert "Buck" Morrison, a genuine working cowboy who had traded his ranch foreman position for a military uniform when the war started. Buck was 52, lean as jerky, with a weathered face that looked carved from the same oak as the fence posts surrounding the camp. He had spent 40 years working cattle across Texas and understood that the best way to handle any living creature, human or animal, was with firm kindness and clear expectations. He approached guarding prisoners the same way he approached breaking horses, with patience and respect. The guard contingent included a mix of men from ranching families and a few career soldiers. Among them was Tommy Patterson, a 23-year-old cowboy from a family that had worked Texas land for 3 generations. Tommy had a gift for languages, having grown up around Mexican ranch hands and learning Spanish alongside English. He had been studying German from a battered textbook since learning about his assignment, determined to communicate with the prisoners beyond simple commands. Corporal James Chen, whose family ran a small ranch near San Antonio, brought a different perspective to the camp. As a Chinese American, he understood what it meant to be viewed with suspicion, to have your loyalty questioned simply because of your heritage. He had watched as Japanese American neighbors were sent to internment camps while he was allowed to serve his country in uniform. This experience made him particularly thoughtful about how power should be wielded over those who had no choice but to submit to it. The camp's medical officer, Dr. Samuel Hayes, was a retired veterinarian from Austin who had been called back to service. At 61, he brought decades of experience caring for living things, though his patients had typically been 4-legged rather than 2-legged. His gentle manner and genuine concern for health and well-being made him beloved among both guards and, eventually, prisoners. These men had been briefed on the Geneva Convention requirements for treating prisoners of war, but Lieutenant McAllister had given them additional guidance that went beyond legal obligations. These women are defeated, far from home, and probably scared, he had told his staff the day before the prisoners arrived. We're going to show them what American values really mean, not through speeches, but through actions. Starting with tonight's dinner. The kitchen staff had been preparing since dawn, following McAllister's specific instructions for a meal that would send an unmistakable message about the kind of captivity these women could expect. After a brief orientation where the women were shown to their barracks and given time to wash the travel dust from their faces and hands, a bell rang across the compound. It was 6 o'clock in the evening, and the Texas sky had softened to shades of orange and purple. The women were escorted to a large mess hall, a simple wooden structure with screened windows that let in the cooling evening breeze. Long tables with benches stood in neat rows, already set with metal plates, cups, and utensils. The smell hit them first, rich, savory, unmistakably the scent of cooking meat. Greta inhaled deeply, her stomach clenching with sudden hunger. She couldn't remember the last time she had smelled anything so abundant, so purely indulgent. In Germany, even before her capture, rations had been sparse. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions, and even then it came in portions barely larger than a child's hand. The women took their seats hesitantly, exchanging glances of confusion and suspicion. Was this some kind of psychological trick? A single lavish meal before deprivation began? Elsa sat beside Greta, her nurse's instincts already assessing whether the food might be drugged or contaminated. Anna Weber's face remained carefully neutral, but her fingers drummed nervously against the table edge. Then the kitchen doors swung open, and camp staff began emerging with massive platters. What they carried made several women gasp audibly. Thick T-bone steaks, each one easily weighing a pound or more, still sizzling from the grill. The meat was cooked to a perfect medium rare, with char marks striped across the surface and juices pooling on the plates. Beside each steak came heaping portions of beans cooked with bacon, fresh corn on the cob slathered with butter, and slices of bread so white and soft it looked like clouds. Tommy Patterson placed a plate in front of Greta with a genuine smile. "Ma'am," he said in his Texas drawl, "welcome to American beef." He moved on before she could respond, serving the next woman with the same courtesy. Greta stared at the plate before her. The steak alone was larger than any piece of meat her entire family would have shared back home. The abundance felt obscene, impossible. She looked around and saw her fellow prisoners wearing expressions of shock, disbelief, and in some cases, tears. Liesl Fisher, the youngest among them, touched her steak with a finger, as if confirming it was real. Lieutenant McAllister stood at the front of the hall and spoke through the translator. "This is standard fare for American servicemen, and for our prisoners. You will eat 3 meals a day of similar quality. We believe in treating people with dignity, regardless of which side they fought on." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Anna Weber picked up her knife and fork, cut a piece of steak, and placed it in her mouth. Her eyes closed involuntarily as she chewed. One by one, the other women followed her lead. The morning after that first impossible meal, the women woke to reveille at 6 o'clock. The September dawn broke cool and clear over the Texas prairie, a welcome respite from the previous day's heat. Greta, dressed in the clean work clothes that had been provided, plain cotton shirts and sturdy trousers that felt strange after months in military uniforms. The fabric was soft, well made, another small luxury that contradicted everything she had been told about American deprivation and weakness. Breakfast proved the previous night's dinner had not been an anomaly. Scrambled eggs, thick slices of bacon, toast with real butter and jam, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee rather than the roasted grain substitute they had been drinking in Germany for years. Greta watched young Liesl pile her plate high, eating with the desperate enthusiasm of someone who still feared this abundance might disappear at any moment. After breakfast, Lieutenant McAllister addressed the assembled prisoners through the translator. "You will work 6 days a week, with Sundays for rest and personal time. Work assignments will be based on your skills and the camp's needs. You will be paid a small wage in camp script that can be used at the canteen for personal items. You will be treated fairly if you work honestly." The women were divided into work details. Those with medical training, including Elsa, were assigned to assist Dr. Hayes in the infirmary. Women with administrative experience, like Anna, would help with camp records and correspondence. Others were assigned to the kitchen, laundry, and gardens. Greta, along with a dozen others, found herself assigned to what Sergeant Morrison called ranch work. Buck Morrison gathered his detail outside the mess hall, his weathered face creasing into what might have been a smile beneath his impressive mustache. "Ladies," he said, waiting for Tommy Patterson to translate, "we run cattle and horses here. Some of you city girls might find this work hard, but I promise you'll sleep well at night and build some honest muscle." They walked beyond the main camp compound to where cattle grazed in large pastures. The morning air smelled of grass and earth and animal warmth. Greta had never been this close to livestock before. Munich had parks and boulevards, not ranches. The cattle were enormous, their dark eyes regarding the approaching women with mild curiosity. Tommy Patterson took it upon himself to teach Greta's group the basics. He demonstrated how to mend fence posts, how to distribute feed, how to approach the animals without startling them. His German was halting but earnest, and when words failed, he relied on gestures and demonstrations. He had infinite patience, never showing frustration when the women struggled with unfamiliar tasks. Greta found herself assigned to help water the horses, magnificent animals kept in a separate corral. As she filled troughs under Tommy's watchful eye, a chestnut mare approached her, breath warm against her outstretched hand. Something in Greta's chest loosened slightly, a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. The horse didn't care about nations or wars or ideology. It simply accepted her presence, judging her only by the gentleness of her touch. By the end of their first week at Camp Hearn, the German women found themselves navigating a reality that defied everything their years of propaganda had taught them. America was supposed to be weak, decadent, collapsing under the weight of its own racial mixing and cultural degeneracy. That was what the newsreels had shown, what their officers had told them, what they had believed without question. But the evidence before their eyes told a completely different story. The abundance was relentless and casual. Fresh meat appeared at nearly every meal. Vegetables came in varieties some of the women had never seen before. The guards threw away food that would have fed a German family for days. Greta watched one evening as kitchen staff scraped leftover beans into a compost bin, and she felt something between outrage and wonder. In Munich, her mother had carefully saved every scrap, stretching meals through creativity and desperation. Here, waste seemed built into the very structure of daily life. But it wasn't just the food. The Americans threw away clothing that could have been mended, discarded tools that needed only minor repairs, and treated resources with a carelessness that spoke of seemingly endless supply. Elsa, working in the infirmary, marveled at the medical supplies. Bandages were used once and discarded. Medications came in quantities that would have supplied a German field hospital for months. Dr. Hayes noticed her careful rationing instincts and gently told her through Tommy's translation that there was no need to conserve so strictly. Yet paradoxically, this same abundance made the Americans generous rather than hoarding. When Anna's eyeglasses broke while working on camp records, Lieutenant McAllister arranged for an optometrist to visit from the nearby town of Hearn to fit her for new ones, at no cost to her. When Liesel mentioned during one of Tommy's English lessons that she missed music, Buck Morrison brought his guitar to the camp that evening and played folk songs for anyone who wanted to listen. The guards shared cigarettes freely, offered extra blankets without being asked, and showed genuine concern when prisoners fell ill. Corporal Chen noticed that Greta struggled with the afternoon heat during ranch work and taught her how to wet a bandana and tie it around her neck for cooling, the same trick Mexican vaqueros had used for generations. These small kindnesses accumulated like drops of water, eventually filling a cup. What disturbed Greta most was not the abundance itself, but what it implied about the lies she had been told. If America was this strong, this wealthy, this capable of feeding its prisoners better than Germany fed its own citizens, then what did that say about the war's inevitable outcome? What did it say about the regime she had served? At night, lying in her bunk, Greta listened to whispered conversations among her fellow prisoners. They were all grappling with the same cognitive dissonance, trying to reconcile their beliefs with their experiences. Some clung to explanations. This was just Texas, just one camp, not representative of the whole country. But doubt had taken root, and it grew stronger with each passing day. 3 weeks into their captivity, the International Red Cross delivered the first batch of mail to Camp Hearn. Lieutenant McAllister announced during breakfast that letters had arrived, and the mess hall fell into electric silence. For weeks, the women had existed in a strange limbo, disconnected from everything they had known. Now, finally, they would have news from home. The mail call took place in the common room after the morning work details. Each woman waited with barely contained anxiety as names were called. Some received multiple letters, others only one. Many heard their names not called at all. Greta's heart pounded as she waited. And then, Schumann. Greta. Lieutenant McAllister handed her 2 thin envelopes, and she clutched them like precious relics. She found a quiet corner before opening them. The first was from her younger sister Marguerite, dated 6 weeks earlier. The handwriting was shaky, rushed. Greta read with growing horror. Their Munich neighborhood had been bombed in July. The bookshop was gone, reduced to rubble and ash. Their father had been killed in the raid, buried under the creed. In a collapsed building he had spent his life filling with books. Their mother and 2 younger brothers had survived only because they had been visiting relatives in the countryside. The second letter was from her mother, written in a careful script that betrayed her effort to remain composed. "We are living with your aunt now. There is not much food. Margaretti works in a factory making ammunition. Your brothers may be called up soon. though they are still so young. We pray for you daily. Come home safely when this madness ends." Greta sat frozen, the letters trembling in her hands. Her father was dead. The shop where she had spent countless childhood hours reading in corners was gone. Her family was scattered, hungry, and facing an uncertain future. Around her, similar scenes were unfolding. Elsa had received news that her childhood home in Hamburg had been destroyed in the massive firebombing raids. She sat with her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Anna Weber had learned that her sister's family had been killed when their apartment building took a direct hit. Liesel's letter brought the devastating news that all three of her brothers were missing in action on the Eastern Front, their fates unknown. One by one, the women absorbed the reality of what was happening to their homeland while they sat in safety, eating American beef and sleeping in warm barracks. The American guards responded with unexpected compassion. Tommy Patterson brought Greta a cup of coffee and sat quietly nearby, not speaking but offering his presence as comfort. Dr. Hayes made himself available in the infirmary for anyone who needed to talk. Buck Morrison canceled afternoon work details, recognizing that the women needed time to process their grief. That evening, the mess hall was quieter than it had ever been. The women ate mechanically, their thoughts thousands of miles away. Lieutenant McAllister stood and spoke briefly. "I'm sorry for your losses. War brings grief to all sides. We cannot change what has happened, but we can honor those we've lost by treating each other with humanity." In the days following the devastating letters, the women threw themselves into their work with new intensity. Physical labor became a form of therapy, a way to exhaust their bodies so their minds might rest from grief and worry. Greta found particular solace in the ranch work, where the demands of caring for animals left little room for dark thoughts. Buck Morrison seemed to understand this instinctively. He increased the workload gradually, teaching the women more complex tasks that required concentration and skill. Greta learned how to properly saddle a horse, how to read the animal's moods and movements, how to anticipate when cattle might bolt or when a horse needed gentler handling. The work was physically demanding in the Texas heat, but it was also honest and straightforward in a way that nothing in her life had been for years. Tommy Patterson became her patient teacher in the art of working with horses. He showed her how to approach them from the side where they could see her clearly, how to speak in low, calm tones that communicated safety rather than threat. The chestnut mare she had first touched weeks ago, a horse named Rosie, seemed to have adopted Greta as a favorite. Each morning, when Greta arrived at the corral, Rosie would walk to the fence and nuzzle her shoulder in greeting. "There's something healing about horses," Tommy told her one afternoon as they worked together to groom the animals. "They don't judge you for your past. They only care about how you treat them right now, in this moment." His simple philosophy, delivered in his slow Texas drawl and translated through gestures when his German failed, resonated deeply with Greta. Elsa found similar purpose in the infirmary. Dr. Hayes had recognized her genuine skill as a nurse and began teaching her American medical techniques that differed from her German training. She learned new approaches to wound care, different medications, and alternative treatment philosophies. The work kept her hands busy and gave her a sense of contributing something positive after months of tending wounded soldiers in field hospitals where death had been a constant companion. In the gardens, Anna Weber discovered she had a talent for growing things. She organized the other women assigned to agricultural work with the same efficiency she had once applied to military logistics. Under her direction, the garden plots flourished, with vegetables that supplemented the camp's food supply. There was something deeply satisfying about nurturing life from soil, about watching seeds transform into plants that would feed people rather than harm them. Even young Liesel, working in the camp kitchen, found that the repetitive tasks of preparing food, washing dishes, and maintaining cleanliness gave structure to her days. The kitchen staff, a mix of American soldiers and civilian workers, treated her with kindness, teaching her English phrases through the universal language of cooking. As October arrived and the brutal Texas summer began softening into autumn, the women noticed changes in themselves. Their hands had developed calluses, their skin had bronzed despite their efforts to stay covered, their bodies had grown stronger from physical labor and regular meals. The first Saturday of October brought an announcement that puzzled the German women. Lieutenant McAllister informed them during breakfast that evening would feature a special camp barbecue, a Texas tradition he wanted to share with everyone. The women had grown accustomed to the quality of their daily meals, but the elaborate preparations happening throughout the day suggested something beyond their normal routine. By mid-afternoon, the guards had set up long tables outside in an open area between the barracks and the main compound. Buck Morrison and several others were tending massive grills constructed from oil drums cut in half, where enormous cuts of beef brisket had been smoking since dawn. The smell of wood smoke and seasoned meat drifted across the entire camp, rich and intoxicating. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the women were invited to gather at the outdoor tables. What they found was unlike anything they had experienced in captivity. This was not merely a meal, it was a celebration. The Americans had prepared enough food to feed a small army. The slow-cooked brisket, ribs glistening with sauce, sausages, potato salad, coleslaw, beans, and cornbread, still warm from the oven. But it was more than just food. Someone had brought a phonograph and records of American music. The sounds of big band swing and country western tunes filled the evening air. Several guards had brought their personal instruments: Tommy's guitar, Buck's fiddle, and Corporal Chen's harmonica. They began playing together, creating live music that made several of the women smile despite themselves. Lieutenant McAllister moved among the tables, ensuring everyone had full plates and felt welcome. He explained through Tommy's translation that in Texas, a barbecue was about community and bringing people together. "We believe that sharing a meal is how strangers become neighbors," he said simply. As the evening progressed and inhibitions loosened, something remarkable happened. Buck Morrison and two other guards demonstrated a simple square dance, their boots kicking up dust as they moved through the basic steps. The dance looked absurd and joyful, so different from the formal waltzes the German women had learned in their youth. Tommy Patterson approached Greta with an embarrassed grin and, through a combination of English and German, asked if she would like to learn the steps. She hesitated, aware that her fellow prisoners were watching, conscious of invisible lines that separated captive from captor. But something about the evening, the music, the warmth of the fire, and the genuine friendliness in Tommy's face made her say yes. He taught her the basic steps patiently, laughing good-naturedly when she stumbled, offering his hand for balance without any trace of superiority or condescension. Soon, other women joined in, partnered with American guards who treated them with courteous respect. Elsa found herself learning steps from Corporal Chen. Even Anna Weber, always so serious and reserved, allowed Buck Morrison to show her how to do Sea-Doo. For a few hours on that October evening, the war seemed very far away. There were no uniforms, no enemies, just people sharing food and music under a Texas sky. 2 weeks after the barbecue, a visitor arrived at Camp Hearn who would change the women's story in ways they could not have anticipated. Margaret Burke White, a renowned photographer from Life magazine, had been assigned to document prisoner of war camps across America. She arrived with press credentials, several cameras, and a reputation for capturing images that told powerful human stories. Lieutenant McAllister was initially hesitant about allowing press access to his facility. He worried about exploiting his prisoners or creating propaganda that might harm rather than help. But Burke White was persuasive. "The American people need to see how we treat prisoners of war," she argued. "It says something important about who we are as a nation." After securing permission from his superiors, McAllister agreed, with strict conditions. The women must consent to being photographed, nothing could be staged or manipulated, and any prisoner who wished to avoid the camera would be respected. When the translator explained the situation, most of the women were ambivalent. They had grown so accustomed to their daily routines that the presence of a camera seemed merely an odd interruption. Burke White spent 3 days at the camp, observing the daily rhythms and capturing moments as they naturally occurred. She photographed Elsa working alongside Dr. Hayes in the infirmary, her concentration evident as she carefully bandaged a guard's injured hand. She captured Anna in the gardens, dirt under her fingernails, holding a basket of freshly harvested vegetables with something approaching pride on her usually stern face. But the photograph that would eventually appear in Life magazine was taken on the 3rd day. Greta was working with Rosie in the corral, teaching the mare to respond to a lunge line under Tommy Patterson's supervision. Burke White noticed the natural connection between woman and horse. The way Greta's entire posture had softened as she worked, the gentle smile on her face that transformed her from enemy prisoner into simply a young woman discovering a new skill. The resulting image was striking. Greta stood in profile, her work clothes dusty, her hair tied back with a simple scarf, one hand extended toward Rosie as the horse responded to her command. Tommy stood in the background, his cowboy hat pushed back, watching with an expression of patient encouragement. The composition captured something essential about Camp Hearn: the unexpected humanity of captivity, the possibility of connection across the boundaries of war. When the photographs were published in Life's December issue, they created immediate controversy. Eastern newspapers ran editorials questioning why Nazi prisoners were being treated so well when American soldiers were fighting and dying in Europe and the Pacific. Some veterans groups protested what they saw as coddling the enemy. Letters to the editor flooded publications across the country. But other readers saw something different in those images. They saw American values in action, proof that the United States could fight a war without abandoning its principles. Churches and civic organizations wrote letters of support for Lieutenant McAllister's approach. The photographs became talking points in debates about how America should conduct itself in war and peace. April 1945 brought spring wildflowers to the Texas prairie and news that would shatter what remained of the German women's understanding of their homeland. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, liberating territory mile by mile, American newspapers began publishing reports and photographs of discoveries that defied comprehension. Camp Hearn received newspapers several days delayed, but the words and images were no less devastating for their lateness. Lieutenant McAllister faced a difficult decision. He could restrict access to these newspapers, shield the women from information that would cause them anguish. But he believed strongly in truth, even painful truth. He made the newspapers available in the common room, just as he always had, and let the women choose whether to read them. Greta saw the headlines first. Allied forces liberate death camp. Thousands found dead at Bergen-Belsen. The words seemed impossible, senseless. She picked up the newspaper with trembling hands and began to read. The descriptions were clinical, almost too horrific to be real. Emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood, gas chambers disguised as showers, systematic murder on an industrial scale. The photographs that accompanied the articles showed skeletal figures barely recognizable as human, their eyes hollow with suffering beyond imagination. She read the names of places she had never heard of: Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz. The reports claimed these camps had existed for years, some since the beginning of the war. Millions had died in them. Not soldiers, not combatants, but civilians. Men, women, children, murdered for their religion, their ethnicity, their existence. Greta's hands shook so violently that the newspaper fell from her grasp. Around her, other women were discovering the same reports. The common room filled with a terrible silence broken only by scattered sounds of weeping. Elsa stood frozen before a newspaper, pinned to the bulletin board, her face drained of all color. Anna Weber sat heavily in a chair, her normally rigid posture collapsing as she stared at photographs of atrocities. Young Liesel ran from the room and was sick outside the building. Several other women followed, unable to bear what they were reading. The translator had stopped working, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was being asked to convey, but the images needed no translation. They spoke a universal language of horror. "This cannot be real," Elsa whispered in German, though she was speaking to no one in particular. "These must be propaganda, American lies to make us look like monsters." But even as she spoke, doubt filled her voice. They had all seen American generosity, American honesty, American adherence to rules and principles. Why would a nation that fed its prisoners steak and taught them to dance fabricate such elaborate lies? And the photographs were too detailed, too numerous, too consistent across multiple sources to be fabrications. Greta retrieved the fallen newspaper and continued reading despite every instinct telling her to stop. She needed to know. She needed to understand what her country had done, what regime she had served, what she had been part of even unknowingly. The days following the revelations were the darkest Camp Hearn had experienced since the women's arrival. The prisoners moved through their routines mechanically, their faces haunted by what they had learned. Conversations that had begun to flow freely between guards and captives now stuttered and died. The women could barely look the Americans in the eye, carrying a shame that felt too immense to bear. Greta stopped going to the corral. She could not face Tommy Patterson's kindness, could not accept his patient teaching when her country had committed such unspeakable crimes. Even Rosie's gentle presence felt like something she no longer deserved. She lay on her bunk during free time, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile the girl who had proudly joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps with the woman who now understood she had served evil itself. The other women struggled similarly. Elsa refused meals, her nurse's compassion turning inward into self-punishment. Anna threw herself into garden work with desperate intensity, as if she could somehow atone through physical labor. Liesel cried constantly, her youth making the burden of collective guilt feel even heavier. Lieutenant McAllister watched his camp descending into despair and knew he needed to act. He called an assembly in the mess hall, ensuring the translator was present for what would be the most important conversation he would ever facilitate. The women gathered reluctantly, their postures defensive, expecting judgment or condemnation. Instead, McAllister spoke with quiet honesty. What you've learned about your country's actions is horrific. There's no minimizing it, no explaining it away. These crimes were real and unforgivable. He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. But I need you to understand something. Individual guilt and collective guilt are not the same thing. He explained through careful translation that evil of this magnitude required many people making active choices to harm others. It required planners, executors, and willing participants, but it also required millions of ordinary people who simply did their jobs, believed what they were told, and never questioned the larger picture. You were young women who served in communications, nursing, and administration. You were not in the camps. You did not know these places existed. That does not erase the horror, but it does matter when considering your personal responsibility. Greta raised her hand, her voice raw when she spoke. But we should have known. We should have questioned. Our ignorance does not excuse us. Buck Morrison, standing at the back of the hall, spoke up in his gravelly voice. Tommy translated his words carefully. Ma'am, I've been working cattle for 40 years. I've seen good horses go bad under cruel handlers, and I've seen mean horses gentle under patient ones. People aren't so different. You can't blame yourself for not knowing what was deliberately hidden from you. But you can choose who you become, now that you do know. The conversation continued for hours, with women asking painful questions, and the Americans responding with honesty rather than platitudes. They discussed responsibility, complicity, and the difference between serving a nation and serving a regime. May 8, 1945 arrived with headlines announcing victory in Europe. The war that had consumed the continent was finally over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. In cities across America, celebrations erupted. Church bells rang, ticker tape parades filled streets, and families rejoiced that their sons would soon be coming home. At Camp Hearn, the atmosphere was far more complicated. The German women gathered around radios and newspapers, absorbing the reality of their nation's total defeat. There was no joy in this ending, only a profound exhaustion and uncertainty about what would come next. Their homeland had been utterly destroyed, divided among occupying powers, its cities reduced to rubble. The Reich, that had promised to last 1,000 years, had collapsed in 12. Lieutenant McAllister called a meeting 2 days after the surrender. Repatriation would begin soon, he explained. The women would be processed and returned to Germany within the coming months. Transportation was being arranged. They would go home. The word hung in the air, heavy with irony. Home to what? To devastated cities, where they might not find a single familiar building standing? To families scattered or dead? To a country that would view them as failures for having been captured, or worse, as traitors for having been treated well by the enemy? That evening, Lieutenant McAllister invited the women to a different kind of meeting. He had been approached by several local ranchers and business owners in the surrounding counties. These Texans had heard about the German women, some through the Life magazine article, others through conversations with camp staff. They had a proposition that was unprecedented in the history of American prisoner of war operations. We need workers, McAllister explained simply. The war took our young men, and now ranches are short-handed. Several families in the area are willing to sponsor any of you who wish to stay in America. They'll provide employment, housing, and support while you apply for immigration status under the Displaced Persons Program. The offer hung in the air like something impossible. Stay in America? Leave Germany forever? The implications were staggering. It would mean abandoning any remaining family, turning their backs on their homeland in its darkest hour, choosing comfort and safety over duty and sacrifice. But it also meant the possibility of building new lives free from the weight of Germany's crimes. It meant remaining in a place where they had discovered unexpected kindness, where they had learned skills and found purposes they never knew existed. It meant, perhaps, a chance at redemption through becoming something other than what they had been. The women were given 2 weeks to decide. No pressure would be applied either way. Those who wished to return to Germany would be processed for repatriation with full honors. Those who wished to stay would receive assistance in finding sponsors and employment. Buck Morrison had already spoken for Greta, offering her a position working with horses on his family's ranch. Dr. Hayes wanted Elsa to continue her nursing training at the hospital in Herne. Other offers had come forward for women with various skills. The 2 weeks that followed Lieutenant McAllister's announcement were filled with anguished conversations that lasted late into the night. The barracks became forums for debate, as the women wrestled with the most consequential decision of their lives. Friendships that had formed over months of shared captivity now strained under the weight of diverging choices. Greta lay awake night after night, her mind spinning through endless arguments. On one side stood duty, family, and homeland. Her mother and siblings were struggling to survive in occupied Germany. They needed her. Her father had died believing she would return to help rebuild what the war had destroyed. How could she abandon them for her own comfort and safety? What kind of daughter, what kind of German, would choose exile over responsibility? But on the other side stood something she had never expected to find: a future. In Texas, she had discovered talents she never knew she possessed. Working with horses had awakened something in her soul, a connection to living things and to the land that felt truer than anything she had experienced in her previous life. Tommy Patterson had become a genuine friend, teaching her not just about ranching but about a different way of seeing the world. Buck Morrison's offer meant real employment, dignity, and the chance to build something meaningful. More than that, staying meant escaping the collective guilt that would follow her in Germany. Here, she could be Greta the horsewoman, Greta the immigrant, Greta who made a new life. In Germany, she would always be Greta who served the Reich, Greta who was captured, Greta who failed. Anna Weber had already made her decision. She would return. "Despite everything, Germany is still my home," she told the others one evening. "It needs people who understand what we did wrong, people who can help ensure it never happens again. If all the good people leave, what hope does Germany have?" Her words cut deeply because they held truth. The women who stayed would be choosing the easier path, escaping consequences while others faced the hard work of rebuilding. Yet, the women who returned would be walking into devastation, facing hunger, judgment, and an uncertain future in a divided, occupied nation. Elsa found herself torn between her nursing vocation and her family obligation. Dr. Hayes had arranged for her to attend nursing school in Houston, an opportunity that would transform her from an assistant into a fully qualified professional. But her younger sister was alone in Hamburg, living in the ruins with no family except Elsa. How could she choose education over blood? Young Liesel surprised everyone by announcing firmly that she would stay. "I have nothing left in Germany," she said quietly. "My brothers are dead. My parents' farm was destroyed. I am 19 years old, and here I can start over. There, I would only be a ghost haunting ruins." The camp divided into 2 groups, not hostile but separate in their choices. 18 women, including Greta and Liesel, decided to accept American sponsors and stay. 14 women, including Anna and Elsa, chose to return home despite everything. June 20th, 1945 dawned clear and warm over Camp Herne. This was the day that would divide the women's futures permanently. 2 trucks waited in the compound, one to transport those returning to Germany to a processing center in New York, the other to take those staying to their new sponsors scattered across Texas counties. The women gathered in the mess hall one final time for a farewell breakfast. The meal was subdued, conversation sparse and weighted with emotion. These women had arrived as strangers 8 months earlier, united only by their common captivity. Now they were parting as something closer to sisters, bound by shared transformation even as their paths diverged. Lieutenant McAllister stood to address them, his weathered face reflecting genuine emotion. "When you arrived here," he began, "I wasn't sure what to expect. I'd been told to run a POW camp, but what I found myself doing was watching young women discover who they really were when given the chance." He paused, composing himself. "Those of you returning to Germany carry a heavy burden, but also a precious gift. You've seen that former enemies can treat each other with dignity. Take that knowledge home. Help rebuild not just buildings, but hearts and minds." He turned to those staying. "And those of you who have chosen to remain, you carry a different responsibility. You represent the best of what America offers, second chances and new beginnings. Honor that gift by living lives that justify the trust being placed in you." The translator's voice wavered as she conveyed his words, her own emotions barely contained. When McAllister finished, Anna Weber stood. She had been chosen by the returning women to speak for them. In careful English, she addressed the Americans. "You showed us something we did not expect. You showed us that strength does not require cruelty, that victory does not require revenge. We came as your enemies. We leave as your students. Thank you for this lesson." Then Greta rose, speaking for those who were staying. "We know our choice may seem like abandonment to some," she said, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. "But we believe we can honor our country best by becoming living proof that Germans can learn, can change, can become worthy of the second chance we've been given. We will never forget where we came from, but we will spend our lives proving who we can become." The women embraced, those staying and those leaving, holding each other as if physical contact could preserve their connection across the separation that was coming. Elsa and Greta held each other longest. Two women who had become close friends now choosing opposite paths. "Promise me you'll write," Elsa whispered in German. "Promise me you'll tell me if Germany becomes a place worth returning to." "I promise," Greta replied. "And you promise me you'll write if it becomes a place you need to escape from. I'll sponsor you myself if that day comes." The truck's engines started. The women who were leaving gathered their few belongings and climbed aboard. Those staying lined up along the fence, waving as the vehicles pulled away. 20 years passed like water flowing over stones, slowly reshaping everything it touched. The summer of 1965 found Greta Morrison standing in the corral of the ranch she now co-owned with her husband Tommy, watching their 12-year-old daughter Sarah work with a young colt. The girl had inherited her mother's gift with horses and her father's patient teaching style. Greta's hands, weathered now from 2 decades of ranch work, rested on the fence rail as she observed the gentle interaction between child and animal. The ranch had prospered under their management. Greta had become known throughout Texas ranching circles as one of the finest horse trainers in the state. People traveled from across the region to purchase horses she had worked with, knowing that any animal bearing her touch would be reliable and well-mannered. She had built a reputation on patience, empathy, and an almost intuitive understanding of equine nature. But she never forgot where she had come from. In her study hung a framed copy of the Life magazine photograph, the image of a young German prisoner discovering hope in a Texas corral. Beside it hung letters from Elsa, who had indeed returned to Hamburg and become a nurse administrator at a major hospital. The correspondence between them had never ceased, a bridge across an ocean and across the different choices they had made. Elsa's letters painted a picture of Germany's remarkable recovery. The country had rebuilt itself physically and morally, confronting its past with a thoroughness that would have seemed impossible in 1945. She wrote of democracy taking root, of reconciliation efforts, of a new generation growing up determined never to repeat their parents' mistakes. Anna Weber had become a teacher, educating young Germans about the dangers of blind nationalism and unquestioned authority. The women who had returned had carried their lessons home, just as Lieutenant McAllister had hoped. They became advocates for German-American friendship, sharing stories of the kindness they had experienced even as prisoners. Their voices had helped convince skeptical Germans that their former enemies could be trusted partners in building a better future. Of the 18 women who had stayed in America, most had built successful lives. Liesel had married an engineer and raised 4 children in Houston. Others had become teachers, business owners, and community leaders. They maintained their German heritage while embracing American identity, creating lives that honored both worlds. Buck Morrison had passed away the previous winter, at 73, still working cattle until the week before his death. At his funeral, Greta had spoken about how a gruff Texas cowboy had taught a lost German girl that redemption was possible through honest work and human kindness. The church had been packed with ranchers, townspeople, and former prisoners who had made Texas their home. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and purple, Greta called Sarah in for dinner. That evening, like so many evenings before, she would tell her daughter stories about the journey that had brought her here, about a steak dinner that changed everything, about cowboys who showed her a different way to live, about choosing to become someone new while never forgetting who she had been.